Most people assume they know how to use a compressor, but at the same time they're going, well, now my vocals sound like they've got too much mud and too much presence, and my drums just sound like thuds instead of cracking. My overall mix is competitively loud, but it doesn't have any musical energy and is causing ear fatigue. The reason for this is because we're told to mix with our ears, which is correct. But signal processing in general and compressors specifically, they're best learned using our eyes first. So many people just reach for presets, and that's because they haven't encountered anybody that'll say, dude, there's only 7 main knobs on a compressor. Here's how they work, and here's when to use them. So let's remedy this problem, and I'm going to show you some of the most common problems people are creating when compressing. So let's head over to the whiteboard. The main purpose of a compressor is to take the loudest peaks of a waveform and to turn their volume down so that they're more level with these lower peaks. This gap is called the dynamic range. Now, when you reduce the dynamic range and then you turn the whole track up, what you've essentially done is increase the average RMS volume of the track. And this, even though it's the same volume as before, you get a louder perceived volume, and you also get more clarity and intelligibility in the track. You don't get this pumping and wavering in volume in the stereo image. You get a more consistent spot in the mix. So how do we achieve this? 7 knobs. The first one we're going for is the threshold. Think of the threshold as a line. You got your waveform and you're trying to figure out where do I want to position this in terms of the peaks and troughs of this waveform, right? By itself, it's not going to do anything. It's going to require the next knob, but most of the time you're going to set the next knob static, and then most of your decision making is going to be based on where you set the threshold. Now look, if you don't go deep enough, you're just barely going to be affecting the very tippy tops of the loudest peaks. It's not going to do you any good. And the other problem is, if you go too far, you're going to start digging into the fundamental frequencies, and you're going to reduce the highs and the harmonics, and you're going to end up boosting the bass and the mud and go, I've screwed up my sound. So here's some common issues. People will be like, I'm too scared to damage the sound, or, screw the loudness wars, and I want to be natural or whatever. And so they don't dig in deep enough. And then their songs are way too dynamic by today's standards with all the pop mixing going on in all the genres. The other problem is if you start digging too deep, not only your song, but all your tracks, they're going to start losing their energy and their dynamism. So there's a balance. You do want some dynamic range. You do want some energy and pumping. But if you just flatten it off, you might as well have just slapped a brick wall limiter on there, and your song's going to sound just flat and lifeless. Once you squash the sound way too much, then you're off on some wild goose chase with EQ and other plugins. You're trying to fix it after the fact when the problem was you created the problem right here. Let me show you an example of this using vocals here on the computer. All right, we need an example. I busted out the iPhone. Let's go. Yo, this is Jared with the vocal example. Let's see what happens when the vocal gets trampled. Say what? All right, let's shoot it over. All right, we're in. Here's what we got. Yo, this is Jared with the vocal example. Let's see what happens when the vocal gets trampled. Say what? Let's go ahead and put an EQ on here because I can already tell you this is bassy straight off the iPhone. Let's see what that sounds like. Yo, this is Jared with the vocal example. Let's see what happens when the vocal gets trampled. Say what? Quick 10-second ordeal. Now let's show you what a compressor does. This is even with the EQ we just slapped up. People will go even more horrendously. Here's a -40 threshold. Yo, this is Jared with the vocal example. Let's see what happens when the vocal gets trampled. Say what? People will be like, hey, now I've got that radio sound. Well, let me tell you what I hear. Massive amounts of too much bass, and I hear too much presence. Listen again. Yo, this is Jared with the vocal example. Let's see what happens when the vocal gets trampled. Say what? And I hear sibilance popping out. Here's what an amateur might do. Oh no, it sounds compressed, really compressed the way I want it, but now I need another equalizer. Let's find. Yo, this is Jared with the vocal example. Let's see what happens when the vocal gets trampled. Say what? This is super fast and live, but you can see the problem. You squash it, you get your frequency spectrum all out of relative whack, and you end up with this teeny boxy sounding thing. Now it's compressed, but you're missing the bass because you had to suck that out. You had to suck out too much presence, and I would have gone in and done a de-esser for the sibilance, but you just end up with a mess. One more time. Yo, this is Jared with the vocal example. Let's see what happens when the vocal gets trampled. Say what? You might even come in afterwards again if you don't know what you're doing with another compressor. This is why we don't do this. You don't over compress with a low threshold. You balance it with the next part we're going to talk about. So look, the main takeaway here is that the threshold is telling the compressor when to start compressing, but it's not telling the compressor how much to compress. To do that, you're going to have to reach for the ratio. So here's an analogy for the ratio. The threshold, the string that I had, it's literally the threshold to a door, and you're the bouncer to a club. You're sitting there with the ribbon or whatever, trying to decide who to let in, right? All these sounds, all these people are lined up at the door. The ratio is saying, hey, for every 5 people that line up at the door, I'm only going to let 1 in, or we're going to be over capacity. We're going to peak, whatever the case is. So we're only letting in 1 person for every 5. That would be a 5-to-1 ratio. If we're talking about a 1-to-1 ratio, for every decibel that comes above the threshold, we're going to let a decibel through. That essentially means we're in bypass mode. I know people can be in the comments going, yeah, but you can turn on a compressor to get the sonic qualities, but leave it in 1-to-1, bypass it. It's basically bypass mode. You're not doing anything. If you want to go into a 2-to-1 ratio, what this means is, so look, let's say that this is a 2 decibel peak. For every 2 decibels that passes the threshold, we're only going to allow 1 decibel to come through. Let's say this is a 9 decibel peak, and we're at a 3-to-1 ratio. 9 decibels came through the threshold. So for every 3 decibels that come through, we're only going to allow 1. So if 9 came through, we're going to allow 3 decibels. That's how the ratio works. The threshold is telling you where to start this compression, and the ratio is telling you how many decibels do I let through compared to the amount that actually came through. But you'll find compressors that can get up to 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1, which is essentially infinity-to-1. I would say 20 and anything above, you might as well consider it infinity, which is what a limiter is. A limiter is a type of compressor. It's just not going to let any decibels through, no matter what pops above the threshold. Fresh waveform. So look, here's some problems people encounter. You got a whole lot of people who are like, man, I'm cranking my ratio up. I'm at 15-to-1. I don't hear anything. Well, the problem is they've got the threshold way too high. So of course you're not hearing anything. Then you got people who are like, man, I'm going to crank my ratio up to 5-to-1. I don't want to go any higher because I read it on the forums. I read it on the YouTubes. I'm not supposed to do more than 5-to-1. Good luck. Then you got people who crank their ratio way up because they're trying to compensate for, they don't really know. Oh, I'm trying to do rap vocals. I need them things squashed. Typically, they're going to have their threshold way too low, and they're going to have their compressor up to 10-to-1 or whatever. And yeah, they're going to squash it, and it's going to sound like crap. There's ways to do this, but you don't want to do it on one compressor. We'll talk about that in the future. Serial compressors, parallel compressors. So look, let me show you what it looks like when you go gung-ho and you squash the life out of something that needs sonic qualities, something that previously had a lot of dynamic range. Okay, what we have here is an old track I found, and it's got just some real simple hi-hats. Now listen to the sound and just the quality of these hi-hats. You're hearing like you get a lot of that high-end sparkle back there. Now let me show you what's going on with this graph mode. What you're seeing here is the amplitude of the hi-hat spiking through, passing through in time. And what this meter here is saying is, this is the amplitude, and we're coming down, 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 right? This is going to help you figure out where you want to set your threshold. Not that you should be doing it by eye. Now this graph on the left, you see where it kind of kicks over? That's where the ratio starts kicking in, which means the point right there, the angle is where the threshold is, and it's going to start pushing left into more and more negative decibels. Watch it move left. We're going to push it way down. Let's go down to like negative 45 so we can hear this. I'm going to have to push up the makeup gain and try to ride this, keep the level same for you. Now watch. Here, this white, you're seeing how much compressing you're already doing, and we're hitting about negative 10, negative 11. Still sounds okay. You can still hear the ksh. Okay, let's start running up the ratio. We're at about 5-1. Let's push some makeup gain so you can hear it. Already we're losing some of that ksh. Let's keep going up on the ratio. Now we're in limiter area, right? 23-1. Might as well be a limiter. Let's just go 31 max. Listen to that. That's what we've done versus now here's disabled. Versus thwack, 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 thwack. Now, whether or not you still want that high-end sparkle, I mean, you want something to occupy those really high frequency regions of your mix. This might cut through a mix pretty well if you're worried about muddying up the top. But in my mind, in this case, you're losing a lot. Versus. Don't crush your dynamics by doing this. You're fundamentally altering the sound. And I'm telling you, your clients will have listened to their pre-mixes to tell you, they've already set expectations and they know what their hi-hats and everything sound like. Yes, it's your job to be creative and to make a mix where everything is easily perceptible, but how far outside of the realm of expectations? It's a psychology game with your clients. If you go too far off track, they might think it's fantastic, but it's not the vision that they had for themselves. So you got to play the game. And plus, you're just destroying the hi-hat. You're losing the magic. What's left? Like the breathiness in vocals or cymbal crashes, like you've lost your very high end. For an absolute beginner, or heck, anybody really, here's a great place to start. Set your ratio to 4-1. Just leave it for now, and then start lowering and raising your threshold and see what you get. And if you find a good sweet spot, but you want to reduce the dynamic range a little bit more, then you can increase your ratio or decrease it. But you're going to be dealing with one variable at a time. Now, neither the threshold alone or the ratio alone are going to do anything. They have to work in tandem to get anything done. So we know the threshold is telling us where to start compressing. The ratio is telling us how much to compress. But the question is, how do we know how to set these? I just gave you a starting tip, but in general, how do we know what we're doing? Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the gain reduction meter. Every compressor has some kind of meter or a graph that measures gain reduction. What gain reduction is how many decibels you're turning away after you let it pass through the threshold. So look, here's a threshold, here's a waveform, and then we compressed it like this. If this was 5 decibels and we're only letting 2 decibels through, then we've reduced the gain by 3 decibels. Okay? It's not 5, it's not 2, it's the difference. Gain reduction. The tough part here is that nobody can tell you that there's some target amount of gain reduction to aim for because it depends on the performance, the instrument, the genre of music, right? But you can get kind of a way to get started. And like I told you before, aim for a 4-1 ratio and start dropping your threshold and listen with your, don't even look at the gain reduction meter. Just listen with your ears. Because you know what sounds good. You've been listening to music forever. You've been watching movies. You know what compression sounds good. So close your eyes and just start lowering the threshold with a 4-1 ratio. And when it sounds good, open your eyes and take a look at the gain reduction meter. Now look, this is going to look probably something like this. You're going to have a meter almost like a speedometer, with certain values on them, and you got an arrow that's going to be doing this number, and it's going to be bouncing like this. This is going to be your 0, and let's say this is -20. You're going to be going -1, -2, -3, and it's going to be swinging and bouncing. So you've closed your eyes, you got 4-to-1 ratio, you're dropping the threshold, you get it to where you like it, and when you open your eyes, you're probably sitting around -5 to -7 decibels in gain reduction. That's, I would call, a moderate, maybe a little bit heavy gain reduction. Don't worry about the labels, light and moderate, and like heavy might scare you off, but everything is leaning more and more heavy these days. You might even go extreme in some cases. If you need to squash a bass, you might get up to -15, whatever. So don't worry about the labels. Now, also, don't be scared to do light compression, because if you're doing like mix bus compression, you don't want more than 1 or 2 decibels barely bouncing at a time just for glue. So like I'm saying, there's no rules. Nobody can guide you. You're just going to have to listen with your ears and trust your ears because you know what sounds good. Let's go to the computer because I want to show you the most common problem related to gain reduction. Okay, we're back to the same track that we had before with the hi-hats, and we're going to focus on the hi-hats again, except for this time in the context of the full mix. Now, this is a 15-year-old track that I pulled up, and I did start working on the mix a couple days ago, so it's not perfect, but you're going to get what I'm saying. Listen to the hi-hats here. Okay, we can hear him. All right, now watch. Let's say, let's go back to the compressor. We do want to get those hi-hats a little more dynamically in control. We do want to lose some of that high end. So let's go ahead and just slap that together. And because we are amateurs and we don't really know what we're doing, we still want to do things in solo and laser focus in on the sound of the hi-hat. When that really doesn't matter, we need to be listening to it in the context of the full mix. But we're making that mistake, so watch. We've got our compressor. It's already at a 6-to-1 ratio. We'll just leave that and let's just start dropping the threshold. Away we go. Oh, and we're really going to dig in. We're getting -10 decibels of gain reduction. Let's go further. Oh, that's thwacking real good. Oh, we love that sound. We love the way that sounds. So now, let's go back to our mix, and let's see what it sounds like. Especially now. Where'd our hi-hats go? You see what I'm saying? When you are getting more and more gain reduction to achieve the sound, you're shaping the waveform the way you want, you're losing amplitude, therefore you're losing volume. Yeah, you're gaining a higher RMS volume, but overall that volume's too low. So how do we fix that? We start working with the next knob on the compressor. So look, there's all kinds of problems with the example I just showed you, especially regarding gain staging, which we can talk about later. But if you find yourself in this situation, how are we going to fix it? We're going to fix it with the compressor, and what we're going to reach for is the makeup gain. Now here's the deal. I've still got our gain reduction meter. Now say you've compressed some kind of vocal track and you're watching your meter bounce between -5 and -7. Let's call that an average -6 gain reduction. Now, instead of going to your fader and you're trying to get another 10 decibels out of it, but you're already maxed out, what you're going to do is reach for your makeup gain knob and you're going to crank that sucker to the +6 decibels that we lost. We're making up the amount of gain we lost. Look, let me explain to you this term gain, because people can be like, and they're not wrong, it relates to the ratio of the output to the input. Yes, but the easier way to think about gain, well, the question is always gain versus volume. What's the difference? Think of gain as the volumes that are going on inside the signal chain, inside a preamp, the compressor, the EQ, and that's where you're doing your gain staging. By the time you finished all that and you get to your fader, why am I drawing a fader? By the time you get to your fader, now we're going to use the term volume. So before that, we're talking about gain. So what we've done is we've taken an input volume in our compressor, and by compressing, we've lost an average of 6 decibels, right? Negative 6 decibels. So we're going to use the makeup gain, the output volume, and we're going to increase that by 6 decibels so that when you go back to the context of the full mix, you got the same volumes, right? It's going to be the same general volume, but what you're going to find is that, remember, the dynamic range, that's an arrow. You've decreased the dynamic range and then increased that volume back your 6 decibels. So even though it's sitting at the same level, you've got a decreased dynamic range, a higher RMS average value or volume. So now that track is going to be perceived to be louder, even though it's the same volume. So you might find you need to decrease that again. You could reach for your fader. I don't recommend it. Stay in the gain stage and just go back to your makeup gain. Instead of having 6, just drop that sucker down to 5 decibels. I wish I could write on this thing. So keep tweaking your volumes at the gain stage. So look, let me show you a problem. It's related to makeup gain and it involves makeup gain, but it also involves, well, the solution is the next knob we're going to be reaching for. Let's go to the computer and let me show you that. So we're back on our hi-hat example where we compressed and we lost all the volume, and we're going to see how to fix this with gain reduction. So here's how it sounds originally. Now I'm going to re-engage the compressor to get back to where we were, where we really jacked it up. Hi-hats are gone. So now all we need to do is find the makeup gain knob, which is right here. When I'm hovering over it, you see the value, but it says makeup. I'm pointing at it like you can see it. It says makeup. Okay, so let's listen and we're just going to push that up. Now we can watch our meter. This is the way I prefer to look at it. We can see how much gain reduction we're getting, and then we're going to try to add that back. So let's do it. Looks like negative 15 to 16. Doesn't mean that's where we're going to land, so let's go. Maybe 12 decibels of makeup gain, 11 and a half. So we're back. Does that sound like I would want it? No. But it's there and it's all right, So let's take a look at this. I'm going to undo this entire thing on the hi-hats. Now let's look at the snare and let's repeat the issue. Here's how the snare sounds originally. Okay, now we're going to go into solo mode like we would if we were goofy mixers. And I'm going to engage this compressor already set up to save time. We're over compressing. Now let's hear it. Okay, now we got a big thuddy, thwacky snare, and we're dropping off 25 decibels of gain reduction. So now we go back to our mix. Where's our snare? We got to bring that up with the makeup gain. Let's do it. .21 decibels. That's not horrible. That's still a decent meaty snare, right? That's a thick, meaty snare, but what it's missing to my ear is that initial transient where we just get some of that. We want some of that high frequency striking through without compression because that lets our ear grab onto it. How do we fix that? Well, let's talk about it back at the whiteboard. So look, I just showed you this snare and it's got a huge problem, but how are we going to fix it? We're going to reach for the attack knob. So look, we got this snare, right? Here's our cruddy synthetic snare. And what we've done is we've compressed the life out of it, right? It looks more like that. We're going to solve this with the attack. The attack, if you look at it, it's going to have numbers between 5, maybe 1 to 5 milliseconds, up to maybe 200 milliseconds, 200 being 1/5 of a full second. So think about a snare. Or look, 1 Mississippi. That snare is done in a heartbeat. More so, what we're worried about is this transient. You see this right here? Let me write that word down. Transient is this momentary initial spike in volume. And when you squash that and you end up with this squashed, lifeless snare, that's when you're getting that thud. And the problem you're going to find in the mix is you've compressed the snare and it's nice and fat and round, but you've lost that. And you're finding in the mix, you're having to keep turning the volume up louder and louder beyond where you want it because you've lost the intelligibility and you've removed the brain's ability to catch that initial transient and latch onto it so that it can locate the snare in the mix at a lower volume. That's why in some mixes, like you might just have, I don't know, a hi-hat going, tss, 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 and you'll have some kind of acoustic finger picking guitar going, and it'll be louder. And after 4 measures, you'll hear that guitar noticeably drop lower in the mix when the vocals come in. And that's not just, it is part of it, but it's not just to keep this even volume across the entire song. It's to train your brain to hear that guitar first so that when it gets dropped in volume, your brain can still perceive it and it's not needed as high. So the problem with the snare is we don't have the transient. So we got to keep creeping up the volume. How do we regain the transient? We reach for the attack. The attack is a millisecond setting. So let's say if we want to be complete nerds about it, we can go into our DAW and we can go into the sampler or whatever, and we can count the milliseconds of the transient. And let's say it's 30 milliseconds. So you might be tempted, and it wouldn't be a bad thing, to take your attack and you're going 1, 5, 10, and you're going up to 30 milliseconds. What the attack is telling the compressor to do is don't start compressing for 30 milliseconds. That way, what I want the compressor to do, Mr. Compressor, is to let the transient come through. So we're going to allow that, and then we're going to start compressing. All right, here's what you need to know. This is the peculiarity of attack. I described it as, here's the moment where the waveform comes above the threshold, and here's where we're saying, I don't know, 50 milliseconds. Don't start compressing till 50 milliseconds. That's the way I explained it, and that's the easy way to remember it. But what's really going on is we're not going from like 0 is off and 1 is on, right? We're not going from 0 and then the attack time, hit, and then we're just popping up to full compression. That's not how it works. So we're not going nothing, pow, full compression. What's really happening is over the course of this 50 milliseconds, we're going to linearly and gradually increase the full compression. So what I was trying to tell you earlier was, if you got that 30 millisecond snare hit and you measure it and then you set your attack to 30 milliseconds, you're not going to get the effect you want because you're actually going to start, by the time you get to 15 milliseconds, this is 30 and this is a snare, you're already at 50% compression. So trying to measure it with your eyeballs and with math is kind of stupid because what you're really going to end up doing is setting, you might go up to 45 milliseconds, but the fact is you're not going to be measuring anything. You're going to stop looking at that mess. Here's how you set your attack if you're a beginner. Okay, new drawing. If you're a complete beginner, just dig your threshold way down and set your ratio way high and compress the crap out of this waveform, right? This is how you're going to hear and learn how to deal with the attack. Then come through and just start increasing your attack. This is the moment we cross the threshold. This is where we set our attack. Just start slowly increasing your attack, and you're going to start hearing that transient pop back through. Just squash it. Look, so what you're going to end up doing is you're going to start allowing that transient back through. Then you're going to hit the compressed signal again. So don't worry about what the number says. Just dial it up until it sounds right. You don't even need to look at it out of curiosity. If it sounds good, you're good to go. Back in the day, they didn't have DAWs and all this stuff. They just went straight hardware without even gain reduction meters. Does it sound good? That's not true. They had gain reduction meters, but you get the point. They didn't have timers to read waveforms. It's not true. They had oscilloscopes. Whatever. Let's go to the computer, and I'm going to show you an example of how this works. Okay, look. We're back to the track with the snare that we just worked on, and I just realized I had the reverb bus muted. It's like walking around all day with your fly down in a fancy black tie restaurant. I'm so embarrassed. But I think it'll help you hear this example better. So here's how the snare originally sounded. Then I'm going to engage the compressor where we over-compressed it, and then we used the makeup gain to return it. Let's do that first. Here's the original. Now I'm going to engage the compressor. Look, that was way more obvious without the reverb. That's not a bad sounding snare with the reverb engaged, but it will make it more obvious with the reverb with what we're about to do. So again, the problem is we squashed the snare, which in turn also squashed the initial ka transient of it. We want to get that back. How do we do it? I'm going to show you the answer, but also show you another danger of over compressing. So look, I'm going to play the squash snare, and then I'm going to start increasing the attack. And with a snare, it's not going to be 50 milliseconds. It's going to be real fast. But what you should hear is that initial come back to it. So check it out. All right, here comes some attack. Three and a half milliseconds is all it took. Here's without it. Just back to a thwacky, meaty snare. And we're back. Now you hear that. You hear that initial transient coming through. Now here's the problem. Because we squashed everything else so far, we had to turn the track way up. Now when we open the attack up some to let that initial transient spike through, that transient is going to be peaking. And I haven't looked, but I guarantee you it is. Look. Yeah. We're 19 decibels over 0 decibels full scale on the digital level. That's a huge clip. So the solution to regain your transients is to open up the attack. The problem is if you've overcompressed, and you won't be doing that, you'll end up peaking because you've turned everything else up so loud. So don't worry, you're not going to be overcompressing. And if you are, you're going to see your output gain meter peaking, and you're going to know, I got to go back to the drawing board. So let's go back to our whiteboard, and I'm going to show you the next thing. In the most simplistic terms, we've explained the attack as telling the compressor, hey, look, don't start compressing for X amount of milliseconds. You're going to gradually start clamping on, but we're delaying your start. That's related to the most enigmatic setting on a compressor, which a lot of people have a hard time even grasping what to do with it, and that is the release. So in the same way that the attack is telling the compressor at the start to delay starting what it's doing, the release is saying at the end of the waveform or at the end of the compression, don't stop compressing. Attack is don't start. Release is don't stop. So what the heck? When are you ever going to use that? So look, when you're trying to deal with the release of a compressor, you got one of two goals. And I would say that you can think of it as your default state being a very fast release, which might be 0 milliseconds. You might be able to dial that thing up to over 1 second, but 0 is going to be your default. And the reason you want that is because, like, pretend you're dealing with like hi-hats, 16th note hi-hats, 30-second note, pop, 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 pop. You got these, transients flying through the compressor in time, right? You need the compressor to reset Like, okay, here's your threshold. You need it to reset every time you dip below the threshold. So reset, 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 reset. Because what you don't want to do, like say you've dialed up your attack and you want the transient to come through. Well, if your release is too high, you're still going to be compressing. So you're going to be squashing the transients. So fast release is generally what you're going to be doing. Rap vocals, percussive instruments, even, guitar. The other thing you're going to be doing with the release is you want that overlap. You want a long continuation of the compression even below the threshold. The reason you would want to do that is to either reshape the tail of a waveform, or like I said, you don't want an abrupt change in volume. And I don't mean an increase or a decrease, but if you've got a decrease in volume and then suddenly you're back to flat, that's going to be obvious to some. It's not going to be obvious to your casual listener, but somebody who's like listening to opera or concert hall jazz, like those people know, other engineers know. And maybe we're talking about opera vocals. You don't want that abrupt change. You want that continual flow. You're going to hear me use the term musicality a lot. And that's what I'm talking about, is just transparency. And that's what the release is for. That's the word. We're looking for transparency. So here's an example of when you might use a release. Let's go back to a snare. Let's pretend you got a snare with a big old long reverb tail on it. And what you want is, before the next downbeat, what you would really prefer is for that reverb to cut off before the next, kick drum hits or whatever, so that you can create some space in here for vocal delays, or I don't know, right? You just need to create space. Your release is going to allow you to redefine the shape of this tail. So look, if this is our threshold and we start compressing above here, right? You would expect to return back to this waveform. But if you've got a long release, you're going to keep compressing at this ratio, and you can cut that tail down and create that space. Now, could you reach for a gate or whatever and just chop it off completely? You could. A gate is a type of compressor. But if you're looking for that transparency and musicality and you just want to get it out of the way, here's your original, and it might ring on out. You can chop that sucker short with a longer release because the compression continues. Now, another example, this is kind of getting off the mark, but let's say somebody's playing an acoustic bass, a bass guitar, and you've got, brr, and then again, you got this long release. And what you really want for the sake of the mix is to get more of a synth style, with like infinite sustain. So you might want that initial plug, but you want this like infinite sustain, and then you want to be able to kill the note. How are we going to bring this decaying tail back up to infinite sustain? So look, here's a side note. A compressor, what we're talking about is downward compression. We're taking peaks and making them lower above the threshold. There's something called an expander where we're taking sounds, okay, here's the peak above, but we're taking the sounds below the threshold and we're driving them upwards. Some people might call that upward compression. That's fine. Downward compression, upward compression. It's compressor and expander. Expander is a type of compressor or even a function of a compressor. So in this case, you might take an expander with a longer release and just drive that right back up. So you get that long sustain. And then as soon as the release is over, it can drop off, or you can gate it if you want to. You can redesign these sounds with a compressor pretty easily. Now look, all of these release examples I just gave you, the ones about reshaping the tail and all that, you can hear those, but most of all, it's either transparent because it's happening fast, or it's transparent because it's happening slow and gradual. So that's not the greatest, easiest example for me to show you. But have you ever listened to EDM and it's like, but they'll have that, you got your kick, you got your 4 on the floor kick going, and then you got your bass. And, an amateur might just mix the bass and just have that sucker driving, boom, But what you can do is sidechain the kick to the bass so that the bass is not being compressed based on its own volume. It's being compressed based on the volume of the kick. So what you can do, look, here's our original bass. You can dip that bass out when the kick comes, right? And that's good mixing practice. You're going to be doing that on a lot of tracks. But we're talking about release. So look, what you can do is increase the release on a side-chained bass compressor, side-chain to the kick, and increase that release. This ain't perfect, but what you're going to hear, this is transparent. You're just ducking the bass out of the way of the kick. What you're going to hear here is, you get that pumping. You know what I'm talking about. You've heard it. So let me show you how to do that. That's a great, very obvious, very noticeable example of how release works. Let's go to the computer. Now look, I just whipped up a little bass. It doesn't even have notes. It's just one note. Listen to this. It's got a little bit of warble, but I chose this bass because it's got some mid-range and some of that high end, like, so you can hear what's going on. So I've got the straight bass, and then I've also got this kick. Listen. Now what I've done is I've slapped a compressor on the bass. Okay. And I've already set up some settings. What I've got is a fairly low threshold and a, let's see, almost 7-to-1 ratio. And what we're looking for is to create that womp, womp, womp. And we're going to do that. Let's just say we're side chaining a kick to a bass and we're just trying to get the bass out of the way for the mix. You might be able to hear that here if you're using headphones or you're on speed. If you're on an iPhone, you're not going to hear it, but it's because it's kind of in the sub bass. You're going to hear some more clarity and separation, and you'll see it on the meter here. Watch. The bass is dipping out of the way of the kick, and we're doing it fast with a quick attack, and we've got a very fast release, so nothing's happening on that end yet. Here it is. So you may be able to detect the sub bass getting out of the way of the kick. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start pushing up the release, and I'll put it on this graph mode so you'll see. Right now you can see the compression. Every time the kick hits, we side chained the kick to the bass so that the bass is reacting to the volume of the kick and not the bass itself. Now let's push up the release and you'll see these little white gaps. It may not be super obvious, but you're going to see them start widening, and that's what's going to produce that thumping or that pumping we're looking for. I'm going to start pushing up the release. Listen in that mid-range and high end. Can you hear that pumping? We can even drop the threshold some. Yeah. So look, we don't even have to hear the kick. Let's mute the kick. And you're just going to hear the raw bass. Let me disable the compressor. You're going to hear the normal bass, and then I'm going to enable it, and you're going to start hearing that pumping. Okay, here's disabled. Just a straight bass note. Now I'm going to enable it. Here comes the pumping. That's one way we can use a release. What we're saying is, hey, bass, come down out of the way of the kick, but don't stop compressing. When the kick returns, we're still going to keep compressing. That way you can hear that return to volume, that pump, after the kick has already occurred. So you're hearing it in between kicks. So look, what I just showed you with the EDM pumping bass, that's a very obvious and very noticeable use of compression, and especially release. Most of the time, you're trying to go for transparency. You don't want it obvious that you've been compressing because you don't want to take the listener out of the mix and have them analyzing your techniques. You want them to enjoy the music for the sake of the artist that's paying you or for your own music. So the question is, how do we get that transparency? Part of it's with the attack on the front end. Part of it on the back end is the release. But there's another method, and that's called the knee. Now look, we got a waveform. we're coming underneath the threshold. This is the release that we're talking about. We're creating transparency on the back end. The attack, we're trying to decide how to be transparent on the front end. But there's one more method. So say this is your threshold. We can create transparency, not time-based on the front and back, but amplitude-based underneath the threshold. It'll have some time component to it. What we're really saying is, hey, compressor, instead of abruptly starting to compress as soon as we cross the threshold, gradually go ahead and kick in the compression underneath and start, just like the attack was that linear approach to full compression. The knee, I don't think is linear. It's probably more geometric, but it's an increasingly intense, gradual compression as we approach the threshold. It's hard to show you or to even give you an example out of my mouth what it sounds like. But the point is, it's another tool that we have in our box to create transparency. Again, I'm just trying to think of examples. Like you might really want that in like ambient new age A majors just ringing out and droning. You might want it with opera singers, concert hall, just beautiful reverb pedal to the floor, piano. How often are you going to reach for the knee? I don't think very often. And a lot of compressors don't even have the option that lets you know how often you're going to be using it. Now, let me tell you this. The default state of a compressor is a hard knee. And that's essentially off, right? So here's your threshold. Sound comes up to it. I mean, as soon as we cross the threshold, start compressing at full capacity. Don't do any of this gliding, even with the attack. I'm just saying, when we get to 100%, we're at 100%. And we're not gliding up to it with a hard knee. When you start engaging it, what you're creating is a soft knee. Soft, hard and soft. And we're just going to gradually start compressing beforehand for that more musical, transparent sound. Now, it's not like these are your two options, hard and soft. What you're going to find is a dial, and you're going to be able to turn that thing, right? And choose the amount. This is all getting softer and softer and softer. And if you max that out, you can create like a real mushy, soft sound. The attack is dealing with that front end delay of the start of the compression, that gradual beginning. And the knee is dealing with that amplitude based. This looks like a mess. But what I'm saying is it's both happening on the front end of the waveform. So obviously they're going to have interactions, right? So check this out. Because they're both working on the front end of the waveform, you can have these interactions with the knee and the attack to help design the sound. So look, if we got a hard knee and a fast attack, we're talking about clamping down on that sound as soon as we pass the threshold. This is exactly how something like a brick wall limiter works, where as soon as the sound hits the threshold, you're chopping that thing off. So your next option would be a hard knee and a slow attack. This is the expected behavior of just when you're using your attack, and we're gradually over 30 milliseconds saying, wait as long as you can to get to the full compression. A soft knee and a slow attack. Think about this. You're getting all soft and mushy before you even hit the threshold, and you're delaying on the attack. So it's just like, it's like Play-Doh slopping out of the little cup. You can create some of the most transparent, I don't want to say lifeless, because you might think you're allowing the transient through, but the soft knee is already starting the compression as well. So you'll keep some of the transient. I don't know. It's hard to explain. I've heard people say mushy, squishy. We're back on the Logic Pro stock compressor plugin, and I just wanted to show you visually what a knee looks like. Now, I've dropped a pretty, serious threshold down with a 3.5 to 1 ratio, and the reason for that is so you can see this crooked point right here. Vertically is where the threshold is, and then the depth of that line, I'll show you. When the ratio is 1 to 1, you're getting 0 reduction in gain. And then as we crank it up to 2 to 1, that line starts kicking over. And the reason I have a ratio engaged is so you can see that corner point. That is where the knee comes into play. And what we're going to do is we're going to soften that point and make it rounded off like the knee on your leg. We're going to start engaging progressively more and more into a softer knee. So check this out. Slowly, I'm cranking it up. You see it rounding off till it's completely smooth. So again, what we're talking about with the knee is here's the ratio, and we're dealing with not a delay, but a progressive compression going upwards as we get closer to the threshold. And the way they represent it here is just rounding off that knee instead of having that hard on and off point where we cross the threshold. So looking at the whiteboard and seeing how signal processing works and seeing what a compressor is actually doing, that's helpful using your eyes before you just go off and mix with your ears as people will demand, because when you just do that blindly, there might as well be fairies inside the compressor doing magic. It helps to know what you're doing so you can start mixing confidently, knowing there's not goblins and crap out there. Now look, if you like what we just did with the whiteboard, I'm doing the exact same thing with the equalizer, showing you what they are, how they work, tips and tricks of the trade and the mistakes that you might be making. So click on that video here on the screen, and I'm just going to keep talking for a second so that you've got time to click the video if you want to. Otherwise, I'll catch you next time.